Thank you. I'm very excited to be here today to share what I think is a very new kind of work, obviously, but has huge potential and there's a great need. And I'm very honored to be able to have as panel colleagues with me today, Mark Vander, who is the Executive Director of Shalem Mental Health Network. And beside him is Ann Martin, who is the Director of Restorative Practice, which is part of that Shalem organization. And I'll say a bit more about my connection with them in a moment. And also we have Tom Albright, who is the pastor of Ripple Church in Allentown, which is grounded in restorative principles and moving as a restorative community locally, and that's very exciting. So I'm very pleased to be able to share this with you. Today's going to be a little bit different than the other panel presentations because we've also brought some slides. And the focus will be on relationship building and bringing restorative efforts or practices to that relationship endeavor. I recall back in 2000, I attended my first IIRP conference in Toronto, and that was sort of towards the beginning of my journey, certainly with this organization. And I remember at the closing ceremony, there was a man who got up and said, "We are at the beginning of a movement. There's a wave that's beginning to start, and it's just starting to swell." And I think he was absolutely correct with what he said. And since that time, restorative practices has evolved dramatically, and it's obviously now a recognized field of study and practice. And as that begins to evolve, then there's going to be an increasing number of applications of this approach. So this is just another one of them. And I think that's one of the key points we want to make today, that this is just applying what we're talking about in a different setting. For a number of years, I've worked with a group of restorative practitioners in Ontario called Faith Care, and that stands for Faith Communities Affirming Restorative Experiences. And it's all about going into church communities. We're starting with Christian communities because that's all of our background, but also we see this as having application in all faith communities, but that's kind of where we're starting our work. But this is a group of practitioners then that is helping out congregations that are struggling with conflict or incidents of harm that have occurred within that community. But our major goal, as you're going to hear, is how we can create what we're calling a restorative congregation or restorative faith community. And that's what we're going to look on today. Now, I want to begin by reading a statement from that organization that we use as part of our publicity or getting the word out about our work. And although it's developed for the Christian context, so the language will reflect that, I think you're going to probably resonate no matter what your area is in terms of the challenges to which it refers. The quote is this: "Building up our neighbors, reconciliation, doing justice, forgiveness, and love are at the core of how Jesus expects us to live. Yet a sad reality of our faith is that some of the most painful relationship struggles seem to take place in church settings. Many of us know many situations where bitter polarization and hurt have left their marks on church members, perhaps even causing some people to question the faith itself. Perhaps you carry hurt that you have experienced in your current or previous church, and it impedes your experience of the Christian community. This reality is even more puzzling because people almost always have good relationship-building intentions in congregations. Some come to the Christian faith inspired by its vision of a different way of being together, of doing community with one another and with neighbors." So the issues raised in this little quote really apply to all communities, but it's in that context we're going to be looking at today. So whether it's a school or a classroom, a workplace, a family, a justice situation, a criminal justice situation, a service organization, a neighborhood, or a whole community, people grapple with how to live in more open, respectful, productive, and connected ways, and how to apply harm when things have occurred. So the way that we're coming at this whole issue is we're focusing a lot of our work on what we call the restorative practice framework, and many of you have been part of those conversations about what that might mean. So part of what we're going to share today is about that, because we believe all of our work needs to be grounded in restorative practices, not a collection of practices, but rather a way of thinking and being. This is who we are as a community, And what's really interesting in working in faith communities is that I think the values that are expressed by restorative practices are very akin to the values expressed by faith communities. So it's really a way to kind of ground those practices, but also to live out those practices within the values of that community. So I'm going to just quickly go through some slides that will give you sort of an overview of the framework, and some of you have seen these slides before, and for you, others it will be new. But I want to start off with kind of a funny slide. That's kind of what it's like. We still can care for each other, but sometimes we hurt each other and we let each other down. So the challenge is how we actually do that. And so we think this framework helps us with that. So the framework approach really, as I said, is a way of thinking and being. Its real focus is on building and strengthening relationships. And that's what we're going to look at. And the main concept then upon which this is built, the foundation of the framework, is pretty simple. And so if we can imagine the frame like the frame of a building, this would be the foundation. Good relationships are the basis for strong faith communities as well as learning and growth. Anything that affects relationships, such as inappropriate behavior, will impact on faith community life as well as learning and growth. And addressing inappropriate behavior needs to be seen as an opportunity for learning, and addressing conflict needs to be seen operating for learning and personal growth. So that is the foundation. Obviously, it's grounded in the idea that we need to focus on building and strengthening relationships at all time. And learning and growth, you need the right conditions for that to happen. So learning and growth is impeded when people feel threatened, but it happens when people feel open and safe with one another. Now, I'm going to share a picture that, once again, many of you may have seen, and I'm going to pull out the Hoberman, because I think that when we're dealing with faith communities, it's no different than in schools. So the Australian echidna is an animal that obviously has spikes like the North American porcupine. And when it feels threatened, it goes into a ball to protect itself. So it's kind of like this object, which is called a Hoberman. Now, when people feel that somebody is not respecting them, or they're being put down or challenged, or if we think about the social discipline window, if someone's operating out of the 2 box, people are feeling like that. When I use this in school presentations, and 90% of the work that I do with IIRP in Canada is within schools, and I ask kids, what's happening when they feel like this, they will say, probably their first answer will be bullying, and then they might say, if I feel left out. One girl in grade 5 said, when I was new at the school, I felt this way. So when we're feeling that we're not part of a community, or we're in trouble somehow, we tend to feel like this. But I think this also has huge application within communities, such as faith communities. We may do a lot of things that we think bring people together, but are people really connected? The other thing to consider around this is if we've done something wrong, we do feel like this. It gets to the whole shame stuff. That if we're experiencing shame because we've hurt others or let others down, that it tends to feel like this. In order for the animal to move on, it needs to feel safe and open up. Well, this is the same thing that happens to us as people. Unless we are engaged in a way that we begin to feel safe, then we're not going to be open with one another. Obviously, that has direct application in terms of how we deal with incidents of harm or conflict, because if we continue to approach them in ways that reinforce this way of engaging, people are going to be stuck, and they're probably going to leave, or they're just never going to connect about it. But if we can engage in a way where people are safe and be able to open up about things, then I think you have a very different experience, and people start to feel connected. When we ask kids, who are they thinking about when they're like this, they say themselves. Here they're talking about others. But they also say people can get in, and I'm open to learning. So really what we're saying in a faith community then is we need to be explicit about ways in which we can create more and more of this kind of experience with one another and less of this. So that has to do with when incidents of harm have been caused, and clearly within faith communities some horrendous incidents of harm have been caused. But a lot of times we found in our work, as you're going to hear from my colleagues, that it's really more about conflict, and it's about people not knowing how to work out their issues with one another. The other way in which we understand this is the more open we can be with each other within our areas of study and learning, where people can really be like this in a relationship, then there's a lot more learning going on, but also in how we make decisions, then we're also more connected, it's a more collaborative decision. And the real side benefit or outcome then is we get more connected relationships built. In my home church where I attend, we've been working on this for about 6 years now. And I can tell you that just by using circles to make decisions, to get together to share ideas, and some of them have been pretty tough decisions, people are much more genuinely friendly, and new people who come tell us that. And I think we're going to hear about that. But also we find that the vision is now going, how can we actually connect to the community around us? So the way we engage people within the community makes a big difference for the outer world. So this is also very similar to what you see with IIRP in terms of its general training, that the real focus is on building and strengthening relationships when there's conflict and tensions. We use a restorative approach to rebuild, after repairing, rebuild community. So we see conflict then as an opportunity for learning, and if we approach conflict in this, trying to promote this rather than this, you have a very different outcome. And one of the things that has driven me as a point of passion around this is that I see that faith communities often do things in a way that create more of this when harm is done or conflict occurs, and at times we aren't very good at this. Restorative practice resonates with the values, beliefs of many faiths. I think part of my role as a chaplain within I was in a youth custody facility in youth justice for 20 years, 12 of those working there full time, the other 8 doing other stuff. And it was a multi-faith context. And I understand in working with many, many different kinds of faith that these are values that all major faiths carry in one way or another. The focus may be stronger with some than others, but clearly there's a strong connection, and the importance of relationship building is one of those. We've adopted the social discipline window. You're going to see a lot of parallel here to reflect what does a leader in a faith community who's operating this way look like. And I'm just going to put those up for your quick observation, because this is something that I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with. We simply have used terms like controlling versus punitive because a leader who's operating in that box tends to be that way. And the fair process principles is another part of the framework, the way of thinking and being. So we want to keep this explicitly in mind when we make decisions. So circles are a great way to do that. So the restorative mantra then that we are applying within faith communities is that we want to always focus on building and strengthening relationships, being intentional about that, doing things that we already do really well, like we love to eat together, for example. How can we then do more of that with a relational focus, with an intentional focus? And when harm occurs, then how then can we repair harm and rebuild relationship? So it's all then about having dialogue and engagement through what we're going to call restorative conversations, guided by a common language and a common thinking. And this is the continuum of practice. We've changed it slightly because we think it's about conversations and the common language of the effective questions. But once again, it's really coming out of the same place. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark. And Mark's going to talk a little bit about faith care.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, and what a great, great conference. And big thanks to Ted and everyone My name is Mark Vander, Vennen. I'm a marriage and family therapist and a social worker. And I'm going to touch very briefly on what we're doing with faith care, what's working, how it works, and what we're learning, because there are enormous things that we're still learning and still have to learn. I came to Shalem 9 years ago. It's a faith-based organization, and I started getting calls from pastors and churches asking for help with conflict that they were having. And I was not happy with the therapy bag of tricks that I had, a little bit of mediation and all that sort of stuff, as ways of going after those things. And so in 2007, we pulled together a retreat of some of the best restorative justice people in Ontario and a number of denominational leaders. Bruce was part of that retreat, so was Anne, so was Mark Yancey. You may know Mark Yancey's name, and he's an active member of our group. It was a 2-day retreat to see if we could take restorative practice and build a body of practice from it that a pool of practitioners could use to work with situations that came up in terms of congregations and congregational life. It was a very exciting retreat. The conclusion of it was, yes, this has a lot of potential, and so we formed a steering group from that group that would then operationalize it. And since 2010, we've worked with over 40 congregations from about 8 different denominations. Each one has been its own journey, and as I say, we've learned an enormous amount of along the way. We talk a lot with congregations about becoming conflict-friendly congregations, whereas as Bruce was referring to, conflict is not something to be suppressed or minimized. Often that happens in congregations. Sometimes pastors will think that that's the peace-building thing to do, is to suppress conflict. But we want congregations to welcome conflict as an opportunity for deeper relationship and building stronger and more connected communities. One of the things we've started right away doing, and we learned this from David Brubaker out of Eastern Mennonite University, is we work with a reference group. Our goal at all times going into a congregation is to work with that congregation to become a restorative congregation, a restorative culture congregation, where our way of being with one another is done in a restorative way. We work with some churches who approach us to say, you know what, things aren't so bad, but we would like to deepen our relationship, and so that's ideal because we love walking into those situations. But the truth is that the majority of calls that we get are congregations that are in some significant conflict. Could be between 2 groups within the church, it could be between a pastor and a group within the church. And the first thing we do is we ask them to form a reference group. And what a reference group is 4 to 6 people in the congregation who represent probably different sides in the conflict, but who also can see beyond their own perspective to the larger good. And that group is sanctioned by the church authorities, whatever that looks like, to carry a restorative process forward. And we then come in and we consult with that group. They tell us what's going on, we describe what restorative practice looks like, and together we decide what circles make the most sense, where do we start, who ought to be involved in those circles. We also talk with them about levels of conflict, and I'm going to not focus on this right now because that's another discussion. There are 5 different levels of conflict, moving from problems to solve to intractable situations where the issue has become so personalized that the only resolution for people in the midst of the conflict is to eliminate the other party. And we have that reference group decide what level are we at in terms of that conflict. We always go out in pairs, and it's always a gender balance. And we really try to have one member of that pair be of that particular denomination and the other member of a different denomination. And we have found that that has been crucial. So the member of the denomination knows what all the hidden rules are about and how this church actually functions. And the one on the outside from a different denomination can say, what the heck is that all about? Our steering group continues to function, our faith care steering group, and that's been crucial. And again, these are our group of practitioners that does this work. What it has become is a community of practice. So we take scenarios to each other, We bounce ideas off of each other, and we have learned an enormous amount from one another. And I can't emphasize that enough, how important that is to our work. Another thing that's been really important is training. And Bruce has developed an IIRP faith care training. We're in a couple of weeks, we're heading into yet another one. It's a 3 or a 4-day training. And that's been critical. And faith community people come to that training, and then the goal is that they take it back to their faith communities and work with it. And critical aspect of that training is it's not just classroom-based training, but part of their registration fee includes 3 hours of coaching from us after they leave. Because training does not equal implementation. And we see ourselves as an implementation group, and we don't want more harm to be caused. And so we come in and we coach. Now, I wanted to go quickly so that we could get to Anne and Tom to tell some stories. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Is this on?
It's on. It was on.
Oh. Oh.
Okay, are we on?
I think it's on.
Great. It's great to be here, to have an opportunity to share some of the experiences of faith care with you. I am the Director of Restorative Practice at Shalem, and both respond personally and facilitate situations that come to us when congregations are in crisis, when faith communities are in crisis. And most of the work that we do is responding, although we still wish to have more congregations that are becoming restorative and are taking it on as a culture change. Still primarily our work is a response. I want to go back a bit though and talk about a non-restorative moment in my life, because this is really critical to my understanding of restorative practice and my own personal practice. I was working for the national office of a large denomination in Canada. I had quite a high-profile national job and part of a congregation, and we ended up in a horrible, horrible situation of conflict. We all behaved, myself included, very, very badly. We didn't know what to do with it. And here I was, you know, I was in spiritual formation and small group ministry. I knew all about circles. I'd written a book about circles and couldn't manage it. None of us could manage it. So not only at the congregational level, but the institution. I was at the national office, and people didn't know what to do with it, and the other 2 courts in between didn't know how to deal with it. We behaved all terribly, and it created a lot of harm, personal harm and institutional harm. But it was about this time we were invited as an institution to attend this 2007 workshop, and it was in the summer. The lawyers didn't want to go. I said, I'll go. This sounds really interesting. And coming out of those 2 days with people like Mark and Bruce, I said, this is what we needed. This is it. We would not have behaved so badly if we had had not just circles, because I know how to do circles and check-ins and check-outs. We needed a framework. We needed a basis from which to work. We needed to be able to embrace, as Mark said, conflict to become really conflict-friendly, because churches, I mean, faith communities, they don't want to do conflict. They see it as a point of shame. They try to be nice, you know, okay, we're going to be nice, so you deny it, or I'll be patient with each other, so you kind of distance the whole thing, or you avoid it. It's really shameful. But the thing is, what's happening as with us, we were meeting for hours in each other's homes, having these awful conversations about this person we wanted to get rid of. We were at a 10, we were beyond the 5. We wanted this person out and just out of ministry. It was pretty awful, pretty ugly, really. So that's where I come from, knowing what it's like to be in a really bad situation, and now learning the process, the framework, the philosophy, and walking with congregations on that journey, being with them in really critical moments. So we get called in usually when, sometimes they are at a 5 and we really can't do a lot. Often they're at, you know, like a 3.5, a 4. and we can work with people. And it's engaging in that journey with them to help them to be there in the thick of a really difficult moment. I want to talk about a couple of those, especially as I think there are many similarities, because we also work with schools and we're working now with businesses and organizations, but there's something unique about faith communities. And one of the unique things we find, much sort of to our horror, because when it started to surface, we didn't quite know what to do with it, is that often God gets triangulated into the conflict. And we're starting to call this the spiritualizing of the conflict, because people sometimes are so distressed, they don't know what to do, they're really closed, and they think they've got the answer because they're praying and God has spoken to them. And so often what we find was happening is people were becoming demonized. I'll give you one example in very broad terms because it's quite a complex situation, but a pastor who was working with, he's part of this beautiful community outreach program in his community, and he's the chair of an executive committee. It was ecumenical, so there were people from his church, from other churches. So a couple of people on the committee didn't think he was moving in the right direction, didn't like his behavior, so they were praying about this, and one woman who is deemed as quite a spiritual person said, well, you know, in my prayer life, I've really heard that you're just not of God anymore, and that we're of God, and that really we need to get you off the committee because you're going to stand in the way of our project. Now, this is pretty tough stuff. But for 3 years at least, these people were just having really awful, awful conversations. Now, this fellow did some training with us through Faith Care. He understood the process, and he felt this was a way in which to try to at least have the conversation. He knew he was being demonized. He knew that he couldn't do anything right, because everything he did would be seen as wrong. Even when we did the circle, he didn't want to bring in a personal support person. He said, you know, they're going to see it as me engaging someone for all the wrong reasons. Coupled with this, at the same time he decided he really wanted to try to speak with these people and kind of open up to what their real concerns were, than that he was of the devil. There had to be more to it than that. And he had hit a personal crisis. He was really doing a lot of personal work. He was really exploring his inner life himself as a human being. So he came to this circle with huge courage and openness. And the long and the short of it, after a very, very long circle with very few people, it turned out really this was all about communication, fair process, about the way in which he managed relationships. So in the discussion, prior to the discussion, when we did the pre-work with these people, this one woman said, this pastor, I don't like him, I don't care about him, I just care about God's work. I don't care about my relationship with him, to be perfectly honest. She was a very frank woman, so she kind of put it right out there. But in the circle, there was a turning when he was so open, so vulnerable, talked about his own situation. They started to give examples of where they thought his behavior was off. They started to connect as people. And you just saw this shift and change, and it became about the relationships, became about them. So after over 4-hour circle with, I think there were about 5 people, it was quite intense and long, they ended up having an executive meeting. They were already planning. They had their first real conversation in years, and it was a real conversation. But it had to be about them as people. So it was a good process. It worked, but that's one of the dangers. I think we saw quite a few in the spring where God does get triangulated into this. So how do you help people not to do that? Is one of the issues. Another issue that comes up in churches, it comes up everywhere, but in churches it certainly comes up, and that is sexual offending. We've had about 6 situations of sexual offending that come to Faith Care. And interesting, I mean, these are just the ones that have come to us, so you can't really say much about statistics or anything, but none of them have had to do with pastors. 2 youth leaders, 1 congregational member, but 3 young men, 2 14, and just on Friday I had a call about an 18-year-old who's sexually offended against a 14-year-old in the congregation. So that's our experience, and that's what's come our way. Again, the conversations that are had, how do you bring people together in really, really difficult situations and have really difficult conversations? And let's take a minute to talk about one where we had a 14-year-old who sexually offended against a number of young children, boys and girls. A number of these happened on a school bus to a Christian school, and from a Christian school, another in a home. In the end, we brought together the boy. We didn't bring the boy into the circle, though he was past his probation period. He could have been part of it. But his parents and 3 sets of parents whose children had been sexually offended, they wanted to come because they held the boy's parents responsible, and they were sure they didn't care about them or their kids or anybody. They just cared about themselves. So they wanted to sit there face to face with these people. They were shocked to find out how deeply the parents of the boy did care about them, cared about their kids. The degree of shame was enormous from the parents. And the point I want to make is this was quite a complex circle, but they had gone back to church just after the boy was charged, and the parents were horrified to see these people sitting in the church, and that's really what divided them. They said, how dare you walk into our church? And during the circle, the father, he hardly spoke. He sat there in that shame position with his head down. He was a mess. He said, he said, what my son did was horrible, but I came to church because I hoped we could have gone through this together. This is a small farming community. They all knew each other. He said, and then we couldn't. He said, this has been so painful because there's been no support for us. What he did was wrong. We own that. The kid, well, he didn't really get the impact. But the parents were really so devastated because they had been so alienated and not permitted to be part of their faith community. Another interesting thing that came out of it is one set of parents came with a letter that they gave to the parents to give to the son about the impact he had had on them when they were 2 young boys. And as part of the agreement, the parents of the boy asked that the other parents write impact statements so the boy could have it. He wasn't emotionally mature to understand at all the impact of his behavior, so that he would have it. So it was a community that needed to be healed, and the conversation, the willingness to be real with each other, to be in conversation, helped to begin some of that healing. I'm going to pass it over to Mark because we're short on time here, and talk about another piece of
So just to wrap up our little piece, we talked about the reference team. I haven't given examples of that, but that's been a crucial aspect of the work. The initial conversations, what's happening, what is your story as a faith community, and what is your vision as a community? What conversations are needed to support and to develop the community's vision? For example, decisions that need to be made. We're working with a lot of congregations. Their church councils, for instance, might no longer actually use Robert's Rules of Order, but might actually do things in a circle format. And there's been some dramatic stories and changes that have happened because of that. What are current concerns and issues? So let's circle up as a congregation and just talk in circle formats. The circle aspect of this is crucial. What are the conflicts and harms that need to be addressed? How is this community governed? Churches are often different than schools or prisons or criminal justice because it varies, of course, from denomination to denomination, but they're often not that hierarchical. Group, committees, ministries, can we do everything in a restorative kind of way? I want to wrap up with another related project that we do at Shalem. It's called the Hosting Project. It's done in a partnership with IIRP Canada. And what the Hosting Project is faith communities that act as the hosts of the restorative practice kinds of events that might happen in their local communities. Hosting provides a tangible way for faith communities to care for people, to offer a service to the community. We're doing a lot of family group decision-making, family group conferencing in Ontario, where faith communities, and this is a multi-faith initiative, faith communities provide their space, provide volunteers to welcome people, and hopefully solve some logistical issues that might prevent family group decision-making or restorative justice conferences from happening. It's a multi-faith effort, and we love that about it. The Pickering Islamic Center just outside of Toronto has been one of our great hosting sites. That's the hosting program. One more. Oh, a church. Okay.
So we're now going to hear from Tom.
Hi, my name is Tom Albright. I live in Allentown, and I pastor a church, an inner city church affiliated with an Anabaptist or Mennonite tradition. I have another hat that I wear. I also connect with the education piece. I'm a career counselor, and I develop job placements for students with individual education plans here in Bethlehem. So yesterday, the educational piece, 3 of those were my bosses up here yesterday. I enjoy wearing multiple hats. Ripple is the name of our church. Ripple is a symbol for us in many ways that I think you'll see are reflected. And this is really, I think, what I'm trying to share with you would be sort of a case study. Because I don't consider myself to be an expert on this. I consider myself to be a person who is experimenting with including restorative practices as a foundation of forming a church. You say, well, how did that happen? Well, it seems like, that's how life is. You don't know exactly how things happen, but about 5 years ago, there was this confluence of, I was leaving pastoring a traditional church. I had found the IIRP while walking down the street in Bethlehem and picked up a brochure and said, wow, this sounds really cool. And I started taking classes in the IIRP. And at that point, my wife and I, our kids were leaving home. And we were experiencing that we wanted to do something different. And this something different came from some people in the congregation who spoke and said, why are so many people, why are so many of the traditional churches leaving the center cities and moving out, into the suburbs? And that had been happening for years. But we took that as a challenge and started meeting with a small group at 9th and Linden Street, right in the center of the city of Allentown, with some people. Some of the first people who came were people without homes. And these people said, after one of the first times that we had gathered, they said, would you do a pastoral visit, a home visit? And I said, well, of course I will. And he said, how about under a bridge? And I said, of course I will. And the next day I was down under a bridge, and our church sort of began from that point. The man who came, I call him our evangelist, because when he says, what do you want to know about Ripple? When people ask about what is Ripple, he says, you've just got to come and see. And I'm hoping that we can come and see just a little bit as you get to experience some of these slides. The church today is changing. Just like the educational system, justice systems, our neighborhood, the church is changing culturally, financially. We're looking at what does it mean to be church in the 21st century. And we truly did begin this group of Ripple as a restorative practice church. We said we want to begin with a much flatter leadership, not a hierarchical leadership, because it seems like the church still does have a lot of hierarchy. So when people ask, what's my role in the church as a pastor, and we at this point have 4 or 5 pastors. We've had people that say, I want to be a part of what's happening here. So we've had some young seminarians come out and join our team. We've had a retired pastor come. And we find that we are not the judge. We are not the expert. And we sure hope we're not the Messiah. We are the shepherd. We do have a priestly role. People do come because they want the rituals of life. And we also we are fellow journeyers is probably the main thing. We see ripples as circles of shalom. The word shalom is such a rich word, meaning much more than peace, but wholeness and restoration. And so we look at what we do in the community as that. We are not building based. We rent space. We're outgrowing our current space at this point. We're looking for new space. Because what we see is that the church needs to be incarnational. By that we mean living in and among the people. So we left our home in the suburbs, and people said, "What? You're crazy. Why are you leaving this home up that you have nice country house?" We said, "We want to be with the people." And so the people in the congregation know where we live. We get a lot of knocks on our doors, and we appreciate that. And sometimes we don't answer the door, but most of the time we are there because we are part of each other. What we realize is that what the traditional church often measures success by is, I call it the B&B, butts and budgets. You know, how many people are coming and how much money is coming in. But in a restorative church, we measure by the R&R, not rest and relaxation, but relationships and ripples. How are the relationships forming, and how is that spreading out into the community? We realize that one of the things that we need to do is that we do things with people. And very quickly, we realized that this church is the church of the people. And so my wife and I did start, this is a food pantry that the group decided they wanted to form in the community. Originally, we just gathered up as much food as we could give and gave it out. If you ask about our church budget, we have what we have for the month, and we try to give it out by the end of the month because we feel that that's the flow that we want to have. Everything goes immediately to the community. But last night, it was pretty exciting. The city of Allentown, their Human Relations Commission, picks a few people in the city and the work that they're doing to recognize. And last night they recognized Ripple, because not the Ripple pastoral leadership. They recognized the Ripple leadership at the food pantry because it's so diverse. We have African Americans, we have people of many different Hispanic cultures. We have people that are of European culture, and this group of 6 to 8 people works together to run a food pantry that serves almost 300 people. And I was really excited and proud of this group last night as they received the award, because we need each other. We really believe that. We don't just say it. We really need each other. We realize that life in the city, the life that many of us live in the city, is not an easy life. These people are dealing with issues of poverty, of addiction, of limited access to some things, some basic human needs in a lot of situations. But when we come together, we're working together to see what can happen. And we do that in circles. And you're probably wondering, how does a church operate in circles? We've grown, probably like a lot of churches. On an average Sunday, our church is probably about 80 to 100 people. But if everyone came, we couldn't fit everyone in, because people come and go, and there's a lot of flow, and there's probably 200 or 300 people who have come to be a part of Ripple. But we've divided the church up, and as we've grown, we've said we don't want to lose that relationship piece. We don't want to lose the circle. So this is called Church of the Sidewalk, and that's one of our favorite places. We have a church. People used to hang out on the steps. The church doors are one of the hardest doors, I believe, for many people to get through. And people would just hang out. And we said, why don't we have a pastor out there? Why don't we have that be a church? So we have we meet out there every week. And a group of people, some bring their dogs, some are smoking, some are, it's real life, and it's Church of the Sidewalk. And this is what's happening, real relationships and real communities forming. Upstairs in the sanctuary, they've taken out the pews, and so we call it Church of the Circle. And we just gather with hands-on worship experiences. Down in the fellowship hall, it looks a lot like this with tables set up, and we call that Church of the Tables. And we I might have a short message, but the focus isn't on me up front. The focus is on what happens around those tables. And very quickly we move into the table, and we often have a meal together. So I have to tell you that I was beginning to feel burned out on church, and I was beginning to wonder, what am I doing here? By connecting restorative practices to this model of church, I have been having fun. I look forward to Sundays because I have made friends, I have learned so much, and it's a whole different way of living, worshiping, and caring in the city. And I am excited to see what's happening. These people that come, really have developed such a level of trust in each other, and we are finding community. We are finding places of restoration. And you know, one of the things that's happened in the church has, as Mark and others were saying, the church has often been a place where a lot of harm has been done. And so we are starting to look at ways to be restorative outside of our church walls, because although people come in, we want to go out. So one of the suggestions was, there's a lot of high school kids that go by our place. And you know, when I first came into the city, you know, I was a little scared. You know, there was a shooting in front of my house. I came home from work one day and there was an outline. They didn't know if the man was going to live. He was shot out in front with some gang violence right in front of my house. And we said, what happens is people go into their homes, and we're looking at how can we bring community. So we're forming a 501c3 called Ripple Community Inc. We're working, and Ted and others have helped us. All of our pastors and workers are trained in restorative practices. And one of the ways that we decided to reach out into the community was we are, as all the students would stream by our place, Valentine's Day, we hand out chocolate candies. At the end of school, we handed out freeze pops. At different times, we're just trying to connect with people and say to the kids, you know what, you're valued, you're wanted in this community, and they're safe places and safe people. And that's just a small example. I wish I could share more, but like Tony says, my friend, he says, come and see.
So before we turn it over to the open mic, I just want to do one more quick slide to kind of summarize this. And this is just a quick summary of Nathanson's blueprint for relationship building. And I'm just going to in less than a minute, go through it. And I think you're going to see this is exactly what's happening in these communities. So relationships are best built when we share and reduce negative emotions. It's achieved when someone really listens to us genuinely. We feel listened to, and what we're going through and our feelings are acknowledged. So that's really the restorative piece of what we've been talking about today. And we have an opportunity to share and promote positive emotions, and it's achieved when we're affirmed, when we feel connected, when we feel valued. And that's a lot of also what you've heard about today, and Tom gave us some wonderful examples of that. And obviously, as we do this, for it to be real, but also for it to really create relationship, it needs to involve the expression of emotion. And finally, that's how we build and strengthen relationships. So it's just applying the relational framework, which a blueprint, which we think is foundational to the restorative framework we've been talking about today. So we welcome people to come up. Thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes. Any comments or questions that any of you would like to make?
Thank you very much. I have a broad question about, and this is less, I hear that what you're saying is very practical about the application of, restorative practices in faith communities. I have a slightly more theoretical question to ask you, and that is about the compatibility of restorative practices with fundamentalism in whichever religion, whether it's Islam, Christianity, Judaism. You know, it seems to me that restorative practice is really based on quite a humanistic perspective, and would that really fit with a fundamentalist interpretation of some of the, the world's major religions? And then the other thing is my experience of evangelical church when I was younger was that it very much played on one's guilt and shame. And in fact, that was the driving force, in fact, behind conversion. And just wonder if you have any thoughts on shining the light of the compass of shame on Christianity in particular, and where that could lead us in the future of Christianity. Thank you.
Two very powerful questions, and whoever wants to take a shot, but I'll start. I think clearly there are some real challenges If people are coming out of a very rigid fundamentalist mindset or way they do their life in community. But I think we heard an example a bit from Anne, that when people are brought together in a restorative fashion, they may not want to start there, but as we begin to really hear one another and connect, then you can have a shift. So I think some people will remain stuck. I think that's just reality. But I think there's a huge potential that we can maybe reinforce what is, I think, good practice within faith communities that are about relationship building, and also have others experience that and shift. I think one of the things that I've observed in working with some more fundamentalist communities, this has to be really grounded in things like scriptures and understanding, and I think that can be found clearly. In the Christian tradition, for example, Jesus clearly talked about relationship a lot. He talked about, he asked a lot of questions, and he really, he was kind of doing a very different approach to people who are probably pretty fundamental. And maybe I'll let somebody else respond to the shame, because we've talked a lot.
I just want to be cognizant of
time
frame. We have that 6 minutes. We can go a couple.
Yeah.
I think the question about shame and guilt is very appropriate. We use Nathanson's compass of shame all the time in congregations and find that people resonate with it immediately. And so it's really helpful for people as a tool to understand what might be happening in a particular conflict or with people. I think ultimately for faith communities, the fundamental notion is that we move out of shame and out of guilt. And here are some practical relational ways where we can actually process our shame in such a way that it moves us to a much better place. But I think it's it's very much indeed what we deal with and confront in faith communities.
I want to ask first, is it fair to assume that congregations and groups within congregations cannot be all things to all people? And if not, how, when you are in leadership, particularly if you have a restorative view, try to design experiences that are good things for most people?
One of the things that we found in Ripple is that we have so much diversity that we do live with people all over the map in terms of liberal and conservative and theological perspectives and economic perspective and age. But one of the things we found is that that's what really works, is because we care about each other and our core values matter so much that then we had a woman who, this is something new. People have found out, they walk in off the street, and they said, this is an amazing place. This woman speaks in tongues. We never had a person speak in tongues before at Ripple, but yet she fits. And so does the person who had never heard tongues before in Ripple. And what we found is the theology, biblical theology, for restorative practices it fits perfectly. According to my understanding of the Bible, God's story and our story from Genesis to the Revelation, if you're using that, those testaments, is one of restoration. From the Genesis story till that final restoration. A story of restoring with God, with ourselves, and with our neighbor. So to us it fits well.
Let's see, probably we have three here. We'll hold it at that. A minute or two each. Thanks.
Mark mentioned Don Nathanson. In fact, Bruce showed you Nathanson's blueprint for relationships. Don Nathanson's been a great friend of the IIRP, and on Saturday I actually travelled into Philadelphia to meet with Don and I intended to spend about an hour with him. He had a severe stroke 18 months ago and he's having trouble walking and talking, but I ended up spending 4 hours with him, and he actually lit up. He actually thinks that Ted as a visionary and the IIRP as an organisation gets where he's coming from. His fundamental premise is that the world isn't complicated, it's just that we complicate it. And that what we're in the business of is actually making the complicated obvious, and that we can help people become aware of what's around them. Having said that, being involved in the faith community, particularly in terms of dealing with all sorts of sexual abuse, I'm presently working with a community that actually where the lay people themselves want to take hold of the conversation about the sexual abuse, because the collateral fallout of that has been profound. And what they're interested in is how do you develop a conversation that is a transparent conversation that invites everyone into that space to talk about what it's like being part of a congregation where someone in a trusted position has violated that trust and has harmed others. How do we reach out in a very real way to those who have been harmed? I guess in my journey, this is a really important, exciting part of this evolution, and it's wonderful stuff. Thank you.
I'm Miguel from Costa Rica, and some months ago I was called upon to facilitate a circle for a church in Nicaragua, and I was very struck by the levels of conflict that you mentioned, and I think I would place that church in the intractable position, and my sense is that the circle was too little too late, but I would like to hear about your experience. What have you done in the past when you come upon this situation? What recommendations would you have? Because I don't think it was that helpful. I guess one thing, they were able to have a good conversation, but that was one of the only ones they had, and it ended up in the church, I mean, part of it leaving. So I'd love to hear what.
Yeah, too little too late is unfortunately common, because by the time people seek help, they're usually just desperate. Sometimes when we feel it's at a 5 and it's really going to bring people together, it's going to create harm, then we just don't do it. We said, this is just not worth it. Or to bring together certain groups of people rather than sort of the obvious people who are in conflict. Well, is there another group of people who could be brought together to have a useful conversation that's not going to create harm? Also, if you are at the divorce stage, I mean, if it really is time to separate, then we can invite people into a conversation. How do we do this with dignity and respect? How can we have, so it's how you frame the question. Why are people getting together? What is the reason you're bringing people together? So being very careful. And I really personally don't see any value in setting people up just to have a really awful experience. So it's part of our assessment process. What is useful? Is this really going to be a useful experience and not create more harm? And if this is going to create harm, are there other ways to work with this situation that are restorative?